Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this baseline expectation of precision. It feels almost like engineering, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's very clinical.
Like you break your arm, the X-ray shows a jagged white line on a black background, and the doctor just points at it and basically says, there it is. That's the problem.
Right. And it's comforting because it's entirely binary. I mean, the bone is broken or it isn't. We love situations where the problem is visible, easily categorized, and, external to our own complex emotions.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of human prejudice or, profound trauma and deep-seated systemic change, and suddenly that X-ray machine is completely useless.
Yeah, you're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just overwhelmingly murky.
Right. And that's exactly where we find ourselves today. We are dropping straight into Jerusalem in the first century, and the air is just thick with grief. The early followers of Jesus are facing this brutal, terrifying crackdown immediately following the execution of one of their most prominent voices.
A man named Stephen, right?
Yeah, Stephen, who was literally stoned to death in the street.
And this wasn't just a tragic, random act of mob violence either. Stephen's execution was the catalyst for a systematic, targeted, state-sponsored persecution.
Well, it was a full-on purge.
Exactly. The followers of this new movement, which, they were just calling the Way at the time, they are terrified. We are talking about violent home invasions. They are being dragged out of their houses into prisons.
Right. It's a moment of sheer existential crisis for a very young, very fragile community. And if you're looking at this from a purely historical or sociological perspective, you look at that X-ray and say, well, the movement is dead.
Yeah, you'd assume the authorities had successfully crushed the rebellion, the leaders are in hiding or in jail.
But we aren't just reading a historical summary today. We are doing a deep dive into the book of Acts, specifically chapters 8 through 12. And we're looking at this text through the historical and theological lenses of two heavyweight commentators, Matthew Henry and Albert Barnes.
And what they point out is that this section of the text is fundamentally about the impossible expansion of boundaries.
Which is fascinating.
It really is. It is a masterclass in how a localized movement doesn't just survive immense trauma, but actually utilizes the kinetic energy of that trauma to shatter centuries of ingrained prejudice.
Yeah, we are going to see how they redefine the absolute limits of human inclusion, which forces you, as the listener, to ask, how on earth does a fledgling movement survive the execution of its leaders and the terror of secret police kicking down their doors?
Well, paradoxically, it survives by being completely shattered. The text introduces us to a young man named Saul, and the language used to describe him is incredibly visceral. It says he made havoc of the church.
Havoc is such a strong word, but honestly, it almost feels too mild in modern English.
It does. The original Greek actually implies a wild beast tearing a carcass apart. Saul is systematically entering every house, dragging off men and women, and committing them to prison. He is the true architect of their terror.
And the immediate logical result is that the believers scatter. They run for their lives out of Jerusalem.
Right. They disperse into the surrounding, less policed regions of Judea and Samaria.
But this is where the historical analysis from Matthew Henry provides such a brilliant reframing of the situation. Henry references Samson's riddle from the Old Testament, which is, out of the eater comes forth meat.
Yeah, it's a profound paradox. The very persecution that was designed to entirely extinguish this movement acts as the mechanism for its global expansion.
Okay, I want to pause on that mechanism for a second, because we often use analogies like, it's like blowing on a dandelion, the seeds scatter.
Right, the dandelion metaphor.
Yeah, but that's a bit cliche, and it doesn't really capture the violence of what's happening. It's more like a highly pressurized system. Think of a pressure cooker. The authorities in Jerusalem are trying to cap the pressure to crush the movement into a tiny, manageable box.
Which it never works.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you apply that much violent pressure to a system, it doesn't just quietly dissipate. It finds the cracks in the container and it explodes outward with massive kinetic force. What was meant to contain and destroy it actually weaponizes its spread.
That is a much more accurate way to look at the sociology of persecution. The text explicitly notes that those who were scattered didn't just go into hiding and assimilate.
They didn't just lay low.
No, they went everywhere, preaching the word. They took their message straight into Samaria. And, we really have to stop and understand the geographical and cultural shock of that decision.
Because Orthodox Jews typically avoided Samaria at all costs, right?
Absolutely. due to deep-seated ethnic and religious hatred.
Let's dig into that hatred for you listening, because if we just read they went to Samaria, it sounds like they just crossed a county line.
Yeah, it sounds like a road trip, but it was actually a 700-year-old blood feud. Going back to the Assyrian conquest in 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered, and the local Israelites intermarried with the occupying Assyrians.
Okay.
So to the Jews in the southern kingdom of Judea, the Samaritans were seen as half-breeds. They were seen as absolute traitors who had compromised their bloodline and their religion.
Wow.
The Samaritans even built their own rival temple on Mount Gerizim because they weren't welcome in Jerusalem. By the 1st century, a devout Jew would literally walk days out of their way to cross the Jordan River just to avoid stepping foot inside Samaritan territory.
That is intense. So for these Jewish believers, fleeing into Samaria isn't just seeking asylum, it's crossing a massive radioactive cultural boundary.
Exactly.
And one of these scattered individuals is a man named Philip. He goes down to the city of Samaria and he doesn't hide. He starts healing people. The text describes unclean spirits coming out of people, paralyzed individuals walking. And the sociological result is that there was, quote, great joy in that city.
It is a stunning picture of restoration happening in a place that the religious establishment had basically written off as irredeemable.
Yeah.
But as with any major paradigm shift, obstacles immediately arise. You can't just walk into a new culture, disrupt the status quo, and expect zero friction.
Right. And the friction here comes from a man named Simon.
Simon the Sorcerer, or Simon Magus, as he's sometimes called.
Yeah. Simon had been operating in Samaria for a very long time. The text says he had bewitched the people with sorcery. He claimed to be some great one, and the population was so entirely captivated by him that they called him the great power of God.
I think we need to translate sorcery into a modern context, too, because we hear that and think of, I don't know, stage magic or fantasy novels.
Right, like pulling a rabbit out of a hat.
Exactly. But in the ancient Near East, magic was an incredibly lucrative, high-status industry. It was about perceived control over the elements, over sickness, over the gods themselves.
So he was a big deal.
He was massive. Simon wasn't doing card tricks. He was essentially the most powerful tech CEO, spiritual guru, and political influencer in the region, all rolled into one. He had the complete adoration of the masses.
He had an absolute monopoly on power and awe in Samaria. But then Philip shows up, and suddenly the people are experiencing genuine, undeniable healing. They start listening to Philip.
And Simon is watching his market share plummet.
Yeah, his numbers are tanking.
Yeah.
So he does something quite fascinating. He believes, and he gets baptized. He starts following Philip around, completely amazed by the miracles.
But his underlying worldview, like the mechanism of how he actually interacts with the universe, hasn't shifted 1 inch.
Right.
And this becomes incredibly obvious when the apostles Peter and John come down from Jerusalem to see what's happening. They lay their hands on these new Samaritan believers, and the believers receive the Holy Spirit.
And Simon watches this happen, but he processes it entirely through the lens of his old life. He looks at this profound spiritual awakening, and he sees a transaction.
He sees a scalable business model.
He pulls out his wallet, literally. He offers Peter and John money, saying, "Give me also this power, that on whomsoever I lay hands, he may receive the Holy Spirit."
Wow.
I mean, this is maybe the most recognizable, profoundly modern moment in this entire text. We live in a society where absolutely everything is transactional.
Oh, totally. You want influence, you buy followers.
Exactly. You want political access, you pay for a seat at the donor dinner, you want a better experience of life, you pay for the VIP tier. Simon looks at the ultimate divine spiritual reality, and his brain immediately goes to, what is the subscription fee for the enterprise package?
It is the ultimate trap of the transactional mindset. And Peter's rebuke is fierce. He tells Simon, "Thy money perish with thee, because thou hast thought that the gift of God may be purchased with money."
He does not hold back.
Not at all. Peter diagnoses Simon's internal state instantly. He tells him his heart is not right, and that he is in the gall of bitterness and in the bond of iniquity.
The gall of bitterness. That is such a specific, intense phrase. What does that actually mean from a psychological standpoint?
Well, Matthew Henry provides a really brilliant analysis of this phrase. He explains that Simon still maintained a massive underlying conceit of himself. He didn't want the Holy Spirit so that he could be internally transformed or humbled. Yeah. He wanted the power to bestow the Spirit so he could maintain his social status as some great one.
Right. He wanted the prestige.
Exactly. The gall of bitterness refers to a deeply rooted, toxic corruption of motives. He was treating the grace of God like a commodity to be hoarded and distributed for personal gain.
Wow.
Henry's point is that true spiritual, moral, or ethical transformation cannot be purchased. It requires repentance, it requires the death of the ego, and it requires a change of heart, not just a change of currency.
You can't buy character. You can't put grace on a credit card. And honestly, looking at our own modern culture, how often do we fall into that exact same trap?
All the time.
We think if we just donate enough to a charity, or read the right stack of self-help books, or, pay thousands of dollars for an exclusive executive leadership seminar, we can somehow bypass the incredibly hard, humbling work of actual internal change.
We want the result without the repentance.
Perfectly said.
Yeah.
And the narrative architecture here is brilliant because it immediately contrasts Simon's transactional, ego-driven pride with the story of profound, almost shocking vulnerability.
The Ethiopian eunuch.
Yes. Okay, so Philip is in Samaria, the city is experiencing great joy, the movement is booming, and then an angel tells Philip to leave this incredibly successful urban center and go walk down a desert road going toward Gaza.
From a strategic organizational standpoint, this makes zero sense. You don't abandon a thriving, expanding demographic hub to go stand on a deserted highway in the middle of nowhere.
But Philip goes, and out in the desert, he encounters a chariot. And riding in this chariot is a man of immense earthly power. The text tells us he is a eunuch of great authority under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians.
He is the treasurer.
Right. He is the CFO of an entire wealthy African nation.
We really need to dissect the sociological layers of this man's identity because they are crucial to understanding the mechanism of this encounter. First, he is incredibly wealthy and powerful.
Right.
Second, he is a foreigner, an African man far from home. But third, and most significantly for this context, he is a eunuch.
Let's talk about the reality of being a eunuch in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Why would a man in his position be physically altered?
Well, in many ancient empires, royal officials, especially those handling the treasury or overseeing the royal courts, were castrated.
Which is just brutal.
It is brutal, but it was a highly effective political mechanism. A eunuch could not father children, which meant he could never start a rival dynasty to challenge the throne.
So no succession threats.
Precisely. His loyalty was entirely dependent on the monarch. So he has immense political power, but at the cost of immense personal and physical trauma.
And there's a religious layer to this trauma as well, right? Because the text says he had traveled all the way to Jerusalem to worship.
Exactly. He is a seeker. He is drawn to the God of Israel. But according to the strict laws of Deuteronomy chapter 23, a man who has been castrated is expressly forbidden from entering the assembly of the Lord.
Oh, wow. So he was legally shut out.
Completely. So imagine this man. He has traveled for weeks, perhaps months, across treacherous terrain, in a luxury chariot, driven by a deep spiritual hunger. But when he finally reaches the temple in Jerusalem, he hits a wall.
Yeah, the religious laws look at his physical body, look at his marginalized status, and say, you can only come this far. You are not allowed inside.
He is the ultimate outsider, despite all his money and power.
So now he is heading home, driving through the desert, and he's reading aloud from a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. Specifically, he is reading Isaiah 53, which is a haunting passage about a suffering servant who is humiliated, denied justice, and led like a sheep to the slaughter, cut off from the land of the living.
And it is no coincidence that a man who has experienced physical mutilation and social exclusion is reading a passage about a figure who is humiliated and cut off.
He's relating to it.
Very much so. He is trying to find himself in the text.
So Philip runs up to the chariot. And I just love the visual of Philip jogging in the dust alongside this ancient luxury vehicle. And he asks a simple, piercing question. He says, do you understand what you were reading?
And the response the eunuch gives is an absolute masterclass in vulnerability and humility.
He looks at Philip and says, how can I, unless someone guides me?
Matthew Henry dwells on the incredible power dynamics at play here. Consider the optics. In the chariot, you have a wealthy, highly educated, powerful government official. Standing in the dirt is Philip, a stranger on foot, a refugee from Jerusalem, likely covered in dust. When Philip asks, do you understand, the eunuch could easily have taken immense offense.
Oh, totally. He could have let his ego flare up, felt insulted by this dusty pedestrian, questioning his reading comprehension, and ordered his driver to just whip the horses and speed away.
But he doesn't. He leans into the vulnerability. He admits his ignorance. He stops the chariot and actually invites Philip up to sit with him.
Think about the psychological mechanism required for that. How often do you let your own ego, your title, your degree, or your bank account stop you from asking the most fundamental question of human growth? Like, can you explain this to me?
We are so terrified of looking foolish.
We really are. We're terrified of looking incompetent, so we pretend to understand complex things we don't grasp at all. We would rather remain ignorant in our luxury chariots than admit we need a guide.
But the eunuch's vulnerability is the exact key that unlocks his understanding. He asks Philip who the prophet is talking about. Philip uses that very passage of Isaiah to explain the story of Jesus.
The ultimate suffering servant who was cut off, humiliated, and yet brings salvation to all.
And remember, the very next chapter in the Isaiah scroll, Isaiah 56, contains a specific promise that God will welcome the eunuchs who keep his Sabbaths, giving them a name better than sons and daughters.
Oh, that gives me chills. The text he is reading is literally on the precipice of promising him full, unhindered inclusion.
Yes.
So as they are riding along, they pass some body of water in the desert. And the eunuch doesn't hesitate. He says, "See, here is water. What hinders me from being baptized?"
What hinders me? It's a loaded question.
Yeah.
Because his whole life, society and religion have told him exactly what hinders him.
Right. His race, his physical status, his foreignness.
And Philip essentially says absolutely nothing hinders you.
He is baptized right there. The text says Philip is miraculously caught away by the Spirit, and the eunuch goes on his way rejoicing.
If we contrast these two stories from chapter 8, the comparative insight is just profound. Simon the sorcerer had physical proximity to the apostles. He saw the miracles firsthand.
But his ego stopped him.
Exactly. His ego, his need for status, and his transactional mindset kept him locked in the gall of bitterness. The Ethiopian eunuch, on the other hand, was geographically distant, socially marginalized, and deeply confused by the text.
But his humility, his willingness to dismantle his own ego and ask for help, led him straight into profound joy and radical inclusion.
It is a beautiful narrative of a movement expanding outward. The seeds are germinating in Samaria and heading down to Ethiopia.
But there is a massive looming shadow over all of this joy. The ultimate threat to this community, the pressure cooker itself, is still out there, which brings us to a massive pivot.
Right.
We've seen Philip cross boundaries, but can a movement actually survive if its greatest enemy is still actively hunting them? We return to Saul.
We return to the architect of the trauma. And Saul is not satisfied with merely driving the believers out of Jerusalem. The text says he is breathing out threatenings and slaughter.
He is a zealot on a crusade. He goes to the high priest and requests official letters, essentially extradition warrants, to travel to Damascus.
Now, Damascus is roughly 135 miles away. It's a different city, a different jurisdiction.
He really went out of his way.
He wants to go there, find any followers of the way, bind them in chains, and drag them all the way back to Jerusalem for trial and execution.
From a psychological standpoint, Saul is operating under the absolute conviction that he is performing the righteous will of God by exterminating a dangerous heresy.
But on the road to Damascus, the mechanism of his reality is completely dismantled.
Suddenly, a light from heaven, brighter than the midday sun, flashes around him. He is physically struck down, falling to the earth, and he hears a voice.
"Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?"
And Saul asks, "Who are you, Lord?"
And the terrifying answer comes back. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting."
In the historical context provided by Albert Barnes, we get a crucial look at a specific phrase used here. Depending on the translation, the voice adds, "It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks or the goads." Wait, let me stop you there. We need to explain what a goad is, because modern audiences aren't exactly familiar with ancient agricultural tools.
Fair point. A goad was a long, heavy stick with a sharp iron spike on the end, used by a farmer to drive oxen.
Okay.
If a stubborn ox didn't want to move forward and kicked backward in rebellion, it would kick its leg directly into the iron spike. The harder the ox kicked, the deeper it drove the sharp point into its own flesh.
Ouch.
Yeah, the farmer wasn't hurting the ox. The ox's stubborn resistance was destroying itself.
So Jesus is using an agricultural metaphor to describe Saul's psychological state. He's saying, Saul, your violent, stubborn resistance to the truth, this crusade of slaughter you are on, it isn't destroying my movement, it is only destroying you.
Exactly. And the blinding light on that road is not merely a physical phenomenon. It represents the instantaneous, terrifying destruction of his entire cognitive framework.
Just a total collapse.
Think about the sheer psychological weight of cognitive dissonance collapsing. Everything Saul thought was righteous, every execution he justified, every family he tore apart, in 1 millisecond, it is revealed to him that he wasn't serving God. He was murdering God's people.
The psychological trauma of that realization is so severe that it manifests physiologically. Barnes notes the medical reality of this moment. Saul is left completely blind. He has to be led by the hand like a helpless child into Damascus.
For 3 days, he sits in the dark. He cannot see, and he refuses to eat or drink.
It is a state of absolute psychological shock and somatic deconstruction. He is experiencing a total ego death. The aggressive, powerful inquisitor is reduced to a fasting, blind man sitting in a dark room grappling with the blood on his hands.
But this is where the narrative shifts from Saul's internal breakdown to placing an almost impossible demand on the very community he was trying to destroy.
Right, because while Saul is sitting in the dark, God speaks to a disciple living in Damascus named Ananias.
God comes to Ananias in a vision and gives him highly specific coordinates. He says, go to the street called Straight, to the house of Judas, and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul.
Which had to be terrifying to hear.
Completely. God continues, he is praying, and he has seen a vision of a man named Ananias coming to lay hands on him to restore his sight.
Now, hold on. From a purely strategic standpoint, this makes absolutely zero sense. God is trying to protect this fragile, traumatized movement. Why on earth would he choose the architect of their trauma to be their new chosen vessel?
It seems reckless.
Why not pick someone safe? Why risk destroying the community's trust? I mean, if I'm Ananias, I am hiding in Damascus specifically because I know the monster is coming, and now the voice of God is telling me, hey, I need you to walk straight into the monster's room, put your hands on him, and heal him.
And Ananias reacts exactly the way any sane human being dealing with severe trauma would react. He pushes back hard.
Yeah, he says, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And he is here with authority from the chief priest to bind all who call in your name.
Ananias is essentially saying, do you have any idea how dangerous this is? You are asking me to walk into the jaws of a predator.
It is the ultimate test of the mechanism of forgiveness. Think about it. How do you look at the person who has caused profound systemic harm to your community? The person actively seeking to destroy your life and believe that they are capable of genuine change.
The wisdom required of Ananias here is staggering. God is asking him to trust the potential for transformation in his worst enemy. God assures Ananias that Saul is a chosen vessel to carry his name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel.
And Ananias obeys. The sheer courage of this act cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
He walks down the street, knocks on the door, and walks into the room where the blind inquisitor is sitting.
Yeah.
He lays his hands on the man who came to execute him. And what are the very first words out of his mouth? He says, Brother Saul.
Brother Saul. It is a radical, almost incomprehensible statement of grace and inclusion.
It really is.
He doesn't say, you monster, look what you've done. He doesn't say, I'm healing you, but I'm watching you. He immediately confers family status on his persecutor.
And the text says that immediately something like scales fell from Saul's eyes.
I want to highlight Albert Barnes's commentary on the word scales because it removes some of the mythological gloss and grounds it in reality.
Okay, let's hear it.
The Greek word used here, lepis, is a medical term used by ancient physicians like Hippocrates. Barnes points out that it doesn't mean literal fish scales magically fell onto the floor.
Right.
It describes a physiological effect, a crust-like substance or severe inflammatory exudate, likely the biological reaction to the intense trauma of the blinding light, and it is miraculously and instantly removed, restoring his vision.
So the physical blindness is healed, but far more importantly, the spiritual and psychological blindness is gone. Saul is baptized, he finally eats, and then he does the unthinkable. He goes straight into the synagogues in Damascus and starts preaching that Jesus is the Son of God.
Which completely short-circuits everyone's reality.
Oh, for sure.
The Jews in Damascus are baffled. Their chief enforcer has suddenly switched sides. The cognitive dissonance is so high that eventually they conspire to assassinate him.
Talk about a reversal of fortunes.
Saul, the powerful hunter, suddenly becomes the hunted. He has to escape Damascus by being lowered down the outer city wall in a basket under the cover of darkness.
From the top of the religious food chain, holding arrest warrants, to sneaking out of a window in a laundry basket. But the challenge doesn't end with him escaping. Eventually, Saul tries to return to Jerusalem and join the disciples there. And what happens?
They absolutely refuse him. The text says they were all afraid of him and did not believe that he was a disciple.
And honestly, can you blame them? It's been a few years, but the trauma of Stephen's death and the home invasions is still incredibly fresh.
Right. They look at Saul and they don't see a changed man. They see a spy.
They see a trap. They think he's infiltrating us from the inside. And this gives us a massive practical sociological takeaway. Saul has genuinely changed internally, but he cannot integrate into this community on his own. His past is too heavy.
He needs a mechanism for reintegration. He needs a sponsor.
Enter Barnabas. His name literally translates to son of consolation or son of encouragement. Barnabas steps into the gap. He takes the immense personal risk of associating with Saul.
He brings him to the apostles and he vouches for him. He narrates the story of the Damascus Road, how Saul had seen the Lord, and how boldly he had preached in Damascus.
Think about the modern application of this mechanism for you listening. We have endless debates today about criminal justice reform, about cancel culture, about the permanent stains of social media, or just about allowing people in our own families to genuinely change.
It's a huge issue today.
It is. When someone has a toxic past, even if they experience profound reform, society's self-preservation instinct is to keep the door bolted shut. We demand purity, and we don't believe the change is real.
What this text shows us is that a reformed person almost always needs a Barnabas.
Yes.
They need someone who already possesses established credibility and social capital within the community to stand up, spend their own capital, and say, I vouch for this person. The change is real. Let them in.
It's a critical sociological bridge. Without Barnabas taking that risk, Saul remains an isolated outcast, distrusted by the Jews and rejected by the Christians. Because Barnabas became that bridge, Saul, who we later know as the Apostle Paul, is able to fully integrate and eventually write half the New Testament.
So we've seen how an individual can change. The ultimate insider and enemy had his paradigm shattered. But that raises an even more difficult structural question.
Right.
It's one thing for an individual to have an epiphany. Can an entire institution, an entire culture, overcome centuries of systemic, religiously codified prejudice?
Which brings us to Acts chapters 10 and 11. This is the absolute crux of the tension in the early church. Up to this point, despite the Samaritans and the eunuch, the core of the movement is entirely Jewish. They still strictly observe the Jewish ceremonial laws.
We really need to explain the barrier of purity here, because when a modern listener hears about dietary laws, it sounds like a lifestyle choice.
Right, it sounds like someone deciding to go vegan or keto.
It doesn't sound like a systemic wall of prejudice. That is a crucial distinction. In the ancient Near East, dietary laws were not about health or lifestyle. They were a profound sociological boundary marker.
How so?
The kosher laws, the distinction between clean and unclean foods, were designed specifically to keep the Israelites separate from the surrounding occupying empires. If you cannot eat the same food as someone, you cannot share a meal with them.
I see.
If you cannot share a meal, you cannot deeply socialize with them. If you cannot socialize, you cannot intermarry, form political alliances, or assimilate into their culture.
It's a survival mechanism for a minority culture living under the boot of an empire.
Exactly. To associate closely with a Gentile, to enter their home, and especially to eat with them, was considered an absolute abomination. It made a Jewish person ceremonially impure. It was a massive, systemic, deeply religious wall designed to maintain purity.
And the narrative shows us exactly how painful it is when God decides it is time to tear that wall down. The story shifts to a city called Caesarea, the Roman administrative capital of the region, and introduces us to a man named Cornelius.
Cornelius is a fascinating figure. He is a centurion in what was called the Italian regiment. He's an officer in the occupying Roman army, the very empire oppressing the Jewish people.
The ultimate enemy.
Yet the text describes him as a devout man who feared God, gave generously to the poor, and prayed constantly.
An angel appears to this Roman officer and tells him that his prayers and his alms have been recognized by God and that he must send messengers down the coast to the city of Joppa to find a man named Simon Peter.
So Cornelius sends 2 of his servants and a devout soldier. Meanwhile, the next day in Joppa, Peter goes up onto the flat roof of the house where he is staying to pray. It's around noon, and he becomes very hungry. While the meal is being prepared downstairs, Peter falls into a trance.
And this trance is arguably one of the most pivotal paradigm-shifting moments in the entire New Testament.
The text describes heaven opening and a certain vessel descending to the earth. It looks like a massive sheet knit at the 4 corners. And inside this sheet is a chaotic mix of all kinds of 4-footed beasts, wild beasts, creeping reptiles, and birds of the air.
It's a veritable zoo.
Yeah.
But more specifically, it is a zoo of everything you are absolutely, unequivocally forbidden to eat if you are a law-abiding, kosher-keeping Jewish man in the 1st century.
Imagine the visceral gag reflex disgust Peter would feel looking at reptiles and unclean animals being presented as food.
And then a voice comes from heaven with a shocking command. Rise, Peter, kill and eat.
And Peter, being the incredibly stubborn, bold person he is, actually argues with the divine voice.
Naturally.
He says, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." Matthew Henry points out that Peter isn't just being difficult. He believes he is defending his righteousness.
Right. He is resting on centuries of strict biblical law. He is essentially saying, I have kept my integrity. I have never defiled myself with the culture of the empire.
But the voice replies with a sentence that shatters the whole system. "What God has cleansed, you must not call common." And just to make sure this thick-headed fisherman gets the point, this exact sequence happens 3 times before the sheet is taken back up into heaven.
3 times. What we are witnessing here is the deeply painful, disorienting psychological process of unlearning bigotry.
As the commentators highlight, Peter is being forced to realize that the rules and boundaries he used to keep himself pure and separate are now actively operating as barriers to human connection.
Yeah, the ceremonial law was a temporary scaffolding meant to protect the community, but the building, the reality of universal grace, was now ready, and the scaffolding had to be torn down.
While Peter is sitting on the roof, totally bewildered, trying to process this massive cognitive dissonance, Cornelius' messengers arrive at the gate downstairs. The Spirit tells Peter to go with them, doubting nothing.
So Peter travels to Caesarea. He walks into Cornelius' house. And we really have to pause and recognize that by simply stepping over that threshold into a Roman Gentile's house, Peter is breaking centuries of strict religious taboo.
He finds a room packed with Gentiles waiting to hear what he has to say.
And Peter stands there looking at these Roman faces, and he makes a massive real-time theological pivot. He says, "In truth, I perceive that God shows no partiality," or in older translations, God is no respecter of persons.
It's a complete paradigm shift. Peter suddenly understands the mechanism of the vision. He realizes the sheet full of animals wasn't really a menu change. It was a metaphor for humanity.
Exactly.
God wasn't just talking about pork and reptiles. He was talking about Romans, Greeks, Samaritans, and Ethiopians.
He recognizes the deep tension between the letter of the law, the strict demand for separation and purity, and the spirit of the law, which is boundless universal grace. And while Peter is explaining the message of Jesus to them, something undeniable happens. The Holy Spirit falls on Cornelius and his entire household exactly the same way it had fallen on the Jewish believers at Pentecost.
They start speaking in tongues and praising God. The Jewish believers who came with Peter are absolutely astonished.
I mean, their minds must have been blown.
Completely. Peter looks at the situation and employs pure logic. He says, "Can anyone forbid water that these should not be baptized who have received the Holy Spirit just as we have?"
Basically, if God has already accepted them and given them the exact same gift he gave us, who am I to build a wall? God just tore down, get the water.
It is a beautiful moment of radical inclusion. But of course, systems of power and tradition do not go quietly into the night. This radical inclusion does not go over well back at the religious headquarters in Jerusalem.
Never does. In chapter 11, word travels fast that Peter has been fraternizing with the enemy. The traditionalists in Jerusalem, the text calls them the circumcision party, are furious. When Peter gets back, they drag him into a confrontation.
They accuse him, saying, "You went into uncircumcised men and ate with them."
Notice the specific nature of their anger.
Yeah.
They aren't even primarily mad that he preached to them. They are deeply offended that he ate with them, that he shared a table.
It is the ultimate scandal of impurity. Peter is facing a hostile, highly emotional, prejudiced room that is ready to excommunicate him. But look closely at the mechanism of how Peter handles this intense conflict. It is a brilliant lesson in de-escalation.
Yes, the practical application here is phenomenal. Think about how we usually handle conflict when we are falsely accused or when we are defending a controversial action. We get defensive. We raise our voices. We match the emotional temperature of our attackers. We argue abstract philosophy.
The text says Peter simply explained it to them in order from the beginning.
Which is so smart.
Matthew Henry emphasizes the rhetorical genius of this approach. Peter doesn't argue theology right out of the gate. He gives a calm, unvarnished, chronological statement of facts.
Yeah.
He strips his own ego out of the defense entirely.
It's exactly like modern de-escalation tactics in hostage negotiations or high-stakes HR disputes. When you are facing angry, prejudiced opposition, matching their emotional heat only gives them fuel.
Exactly.
Peter just drops the temperature. He walks them through the sequence. I was praying. I saw a vision. The voice spoke. The messengers arrived. The Spirit told me to go. I preached. The Spirit fell on them.
He lays out the data points sequentially, essentially saying, look, I didn't plan this. I didn't want to do this. I argued with God about it. But this is what God did. Who was I to withstand God?
And the mechanism works flawlessly. By removing his own ego and simply presenting the undeniable sequence of divine action, he disarms their prejudice. The church in Jerusalem listens to the facts, the emotional temperature drops, and they finally concede.
The text says they fell silent, and then they glorified God, saying, "Then to the Gentiles also God has granted repentance that leads to life."
It is a monumental structural shift. The internal walls of prejudice have finally collapsed. The doors are officially blown wide open to all of humanity. And this leads us perfectly into the final phase of this narrative, where the community takes on a brand new identity, which immediately puts a massive target on their back from the ultimate earthly power.
Following this realization that the message is for everyone, the scattered believers who had fled Jerusalem travel far beyond the local regions. They travel as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch.
Antioch was a massive cosmopolitan hub, right?
Absolutely. Antioch was a Syro-Grecian metropolis. It was the third largest city in the Roman Empire, behind only Rome and Alexandria. It was a melting pot of trade, culture, and pagan philosophy.
Wow.
And here, some of the scattered believers from Cyprus and Cyrene do something highly innovative. Instead of just going into the local synagogues and speaking only to Jews, they start actively preaching to the Hellenists, the Greeks.
And the movement just explodes in Antioch. A huge number of people believe and turn to the Lord. News of this massive multi-ethnic boom gets back to Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas, our favorite sponsor and bridge builder, to check it out.
Barnabas gets to Antioch, sees this incredible diverse community thriving, and realizes the work is way too big for him. So what does he do? He remembers the brilliant, highly educated Pharisee he vouched for.
Saul.
Yes. He leaves Antioch, goes to Tarsus to find Saul, and brings him back. Barnabas and Saul spent an entire year in Antioch, assembling with the church and teaching an enormous number of people. It is a powerful partnership of encouragement and sharp intellect.
But the most culturally significant thing that happens in Antioch is the establishment of a brand new identity marker. The text notes almost casually, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch.
Matthew Henry points out the profound sociological wisdom embedded in this new name. Up until Antioch, the followers were called the Way, or they were derogatorily called Nazarenes or Galileans.
Which were basically local insults.
Right. They were viewed by Rome and the wider world as just a weird subsect of Judaism. But in Antioch, you suddenly have Jews and pagan Greeks worshiping in the exact same room, eating at the exact same table.
Right, so the old labels completely fail. You can't call them a Jewish sect if half the room is Greek.
Exactly. The old labels of Jew or Gentile were deeply dividing markers. The name Christian, whether they chose it themselves or it was assigned to them by the surrounding culture, replaces those historical ethnic divisions with a single unifying identity based entirely on their shared allegiance to Christ.
It is a radical flattening of social hierarchy. It's a brilliant rebranding. It declares our primary identity isn't our race, our background, or our tax bracket. Our primary identity is our connection to this movement.
But of course, whenever a grassroots movement gains that kind of unified identity, massive numbers and cultural traction, it deeply threatens the established political order. Earthly power gets nervous.
Which brings us to chapter 12 and the introduction of King Herod Agrippa.
We need to understand who Herod Agrippa is. He is the grandson of Herod the Great, the king who tried to kill the infant Jesus. Agrippa is a cunning politician. He was educated in Rome, was close friends with emperors like Caligula and Claudius, and was highly invested in keeping the turbulent Jewish population in Judea pacified.
He is a populist. He looks at the political landscape, sees that the Orthodox religious leaders hate this new Christian movement, and decides to score some easy political points.
So he strikes.
The text says he laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He executes James, the brother of John, with the sword, and when he sees that this political theater greatly pleases his base in Jerusalem, he decides to go for the ultimate prize. He arrests Peter.
Herod throws Peter into maximum security prison, intending to bring him out to the people for a public execution after the Passover festival. Now, before we get to the incredible narrative of Peter's imprisonment, there is a fascinating, almost bizarre translation quirk in chapter 12 that Albert Barnes highlights at length in his commentary.
Oh, this is the linguistic deep dive. I love this part. Tell him about the Easter anomaly.
In Acts 12.4, if you read the classic 1611 King James Version, it says Herod intended to bring Peter out to the people after Easter. Barnes addresses this head-on and calls it an absurd and unhappy translation.
Absurd and unhappy. Barnes does not pull his punches, but why is it absurd?
Because the original Greek word in the text is pascha, which unequivocally translates to the Passover. There was absolutely no Christian festival of Easter being celebrated by Herod in the 1st century.
Right, that makes no sense.
Barnes explains that the word Easter is actually of ancient Anglo-Saxon origin. It derives from Eostri, a pagan Germanic goddess of the dawn and the spring equinox.
So how on earth did the name of an ancient pagan spring goddess end up in the English translation of the Bible describing a Jewish festival in the 1st century?
It comes down to the mechanics of translation and cultural context. When William Tyndale was translating the Bible into English in 1525, he was trying to make the text fiercely accessible to the common English plowboy.
He wanted the common people to read it.
Exactly. The spring festival celebrating the resurrection of Jesus had, over centuries, co-opted the local pagan spring festival's name, Easter. Because the Jewish Passover and the Christian celebration of the resurrection often coincided in the spring calendar, Tyndale simply used the familiar local colloquial term Easter to help his 16th century English readers understand the time of year.
He was basically trying to be helpful, essentially contextualizing the calendar.
Yes. But nearly a century later, when the King James translators were working, they inexplicably retained Tyndale's colloquialism in this one specific verse, even though they translated Pascha correctly as Passover everywhere else in the New Testament.
That's incredible.
Barnes points out that this is a classic example of how translators can accidentally overwrite the original historical context of a text by injecting their own cultural baggage.
It's a brilliant reminder that when we read ancient texts, we have to look past the cultural lens of the translator. Words have centuries of political and cultural baggage attached to them. But returning to the actual narrative in Jerusalem, Peter is in a maximum security nightmare.
He is sleeping, bound with 2 heavy chains, sleeping literally between 2 Roman soldiers, with heavily armed sentries guarding the iron doors outside. Herod is taking 0 chances.
Meanwhile, the text sets up a stark contrast. While the empire flexes its military might, the church is gathered at the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, and they are praying fervently, without ceasing, for Peter's life.
And what happens next in the prison is almost comical in its execution. It is the exact opposite of an action movie jailbreak.
It really is. Peter is fast asleep. An angel of the Lord appears, strikes Peter on the side to wake him up, and tells him to get up quickly. The heavy chains simply fall off his wrists.
The angel practically has to dress him. He tells Peter to put on his belt, tie his sandals, and put on his cloak. They walk past the first guard station, then the second guard station, completely unnoticed. And when they reach the massive iron gate leading into the city, the text says it opened to them of its own accord.
It's like an ancient automatic supermarket door. Peter is so groggy and disoriented that he genuinely thinks he is dreaming. He thinks he's having a prophetic vision.
It isn't until the angel leaves him, and he is standing completely alone on a cold, dark street in Jerusalem, that his brain catches up with reality. And he realizes, wait, the Lord actually sent his angel and delivered me from Herod.
So Peter navigates through the dark streets and goes straight to the house of Mary, where the massive prayer meeting is currently happening. He stands at the door of the outer gate and knocks.
And here we meet a character named Rhoda, a young servant girl. She goes to the gate to answer the knocking. She hears a voice, recognizes that it's Peter's voice, and what does she do?
The text says, because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate.
It is the funniest, most profoundly human moment in the book.
She is so utterly overwhelmed with the joy of the miracle that she completely forgets the practical reality of letting the poor guy inside. He is an escaped fugitive, the most wanted man in Jerusalem, standing out in the street, desperately knocking on the door, while she runs back inside to interrupt the prayer meeting.
And the psychological reaction of the praying church is incredibly revealing. Rhoda bursts in and says, Peter is at the gate. And their immediate response is to tell her, you are beside yourself. You are crazy.
She insists it's true, and their backup explanation is, it must be his angel, meaning his guardian spirit or his ghost, assuming Herod has already executed him.
Think about the cognitive dissonance here. These people have been awake all night, fervently, desperately praying to God for Peter's deliverance. But when the literal answer to their prayer is knocking on their front door, their default mechanism is absolute skepticism.
It's the psychology of learned helplessness.
Yeah.
It's like buying a lottery ticket, praying you win, and when you see the numbers match, you assume it's a misprint and throw the ticket away. Or applying for a job you desperately need, getting the offer call, and hanging up because you assume it's a spam caller.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
We go through the motions of asking for breakthroughs, But the trauma of living in a broken world conditions us to expect failure. We don't actually believe our own prayers have power.
Eventually, Peter keeps knocking. They finally go to the gate, open it, and the text says that they were astonished. Peter motions for them to be quiet, quickly tells them how the Lord brought him out of prison, tells them to report these things to James and the brethren, and then he immediately leaves and goes to a safer, undisclosed place.
Meanwhile, the sun comes up, and there is absolute chaos at the prison. A massive panic. Herod is humiliated and furious. He interrogates the guards, and when they can't explain how a chained man vanished from a locked room, he commands that the guards be executed.
And then Herod leaves Judea and travels to his palace in Caesarea, which leads us to the grand finale of this section.
The absolute collapse of the illusion of earthly power.
Yes. Herod Agrippa is deeply angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, two coastal cities. These cities are heavily dependent on Herod's territory for their food supply, so they desperately need to appease him. They secure the support of Blastus, the king's chamberlain, and they come to Caesarea suing for peace.
Herod sees a perfect opportunity for political theater. He sets a specific day, puts on his royal apparel, which the historian Josephus notes was a garment made entirely of woven silver that shone blindingly in the morning sun, and sits on his throne to deliver a grand oration to the people.
And the crowd, expertly playing the political game of sycophancy to ensure their food supply, begins to shout, "The voice of a god and not of a man."
And Herod accepts it. He absorbs the divine glory. He doesn't deflect the praise. He internalizes the illusion of his own absolute supremacy.
And the biological correction to that illusion is instant and horrifying. The text says that immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died.
It is a stark, almost gruesome contrast. Again, historical context is amazing here because Josephus, the secular Jewish historian, records this exact event. He records the silver robe, the crowd calling him a god, and the sudden agonizing abdominal pain that struck him down, leading to his death a few days later from severe bowel disease, literally being consumed from the inside out.
You have the ultimate contrast of two kingdoms. On one side, you have the humble, terrified, praying, persecuted church. On the other side, you have the arrogant, wealthy, beautifully adorned, self-deifying political leader.
Herod thought he held the power of life and death.
He really did. He thought he could cap the pressure cooker. He executed James, he imprisoned Peter, he accepted the title of a god. But in the end, the mechanism of his destruction was his own rotting biology.
And the final verse of this section perfectly sums up the absolute futility of trying to crush truth with violence, ego, or political power. Acts 12.24 simply says, "But the word of God grew and multiplied." Despite the executions, despite the maximum security prisons, despite the wrath of kings, the pressure cooker shattered and the movement expanded across the world.
We have covered a massive amount of sociological and theological ground today, from the trauma of Jerusalem to the joy in Samaria, from the desert road with the eunuch to the roof in Joppa with Peter, from the blinding light of the Damascus road to the worms consuming Herod.
So if we look back at this murky diagnostic landscape we started with, what is the core mechanism we are uncovering?
The central revelation is this. Throughout all these historical events, the greatest obstacle to the spread of wisdom and grace was never the external violent persecution from political forces like Herod or the early unredeemed Saul.
Wasn't the empire.
No. That external pressure only multiplied the movement. The true obstacles, the absolute hardest barriers to break, were always the internal, deeply held traditions, prejudices, and systemic rules of the believers themselves.
Wow, that completely flips the script on how we view opposition.
It does. The hardest wall to tear down wasn't the iron gate of Peter's prison. The angel opened that effortlessly. The hardest wall to tear down was Peter's own religious reluctance to eat with a Roman. It was the Jerusalem church's furious demand for racial and ritual purity. It was Ananias' perfectly understandable terror of forgiving his abuser.
It was even the praying church's cynical reluctance to believe that their own prayers had actually worked when Peter knocked at the gate.
Exactly. The external walls of empire are fragile compared to the internal walls of human prejudice.
That is such a profound diagnostic truth to leave you with today. We started this deep dive talking about that X-ray machine. How we desperately want clean binary diagnoses. We want to point our fingers at the Herods of the world, at the external political enemies, at the obvious villains, and say, there is the broken bone, there is the problem. But this text forces you to look in the mirror.
It really challenges you to self-reflect.
We've talked a lot about the early church expanding its boundaries and tearing down walls. But think about the modern institutions you belong to today. Your workplace, your community, your political affiliations, even the algorithms that curate your social media feeds. Are we, in our modern pursuit of safety, ideological purity and comfort, actively building the exact same walls Peter was commanded to tear down? Are we becoming the circumcision party of the digital age, demanding that everyone look like us, vote like us, and think like us before we will share a table with them?
That's the real question.
What internal gates are you keeping locked today? What deeply ingrained prejudices, what transactional Simon the Sorcerer mindsets, what absolute refusals to forgive might be acting as the primary bottleneck to your own growth? Because the truth is, the breakthrough you have been desperately praying for might be standing in the street, knocking at your gate right now, and you're too busy arguing about the rules of purity to let it in. That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.